My best friend, Isabella, is a pure and lovely girl. She went to northern Myanmar right after graduating from university, and they haven't seen her since. Until one day, while I was surfing the internet, I came across a video of a street performance. In the video, a filthy naked woman, her hair matted and almost glued together, with her arms and legs chopped off, lay on a small cart made of wooden planks, wriggling her body vigorously, surrounded by a crowd of onlookers. The woman looked miserable, her nose, ears, and tongue cut off, her eyes gouged out. When the dwarf man had begged for enough money, he picked her up and stuffed her into a half-human hide jar, and it was only then that I could see her face clearly. My heart skipped a beat. I knew this worm-like woman. Not only did I know her, but I knew her all too well. She was Isabella, who had gone to northern Myanmar 2 months ago, with the dream of making a fortune. Isabella was my college classmate and my best friend. 2 months ago, tired of her job, which paid only a few $100s a month, she saw online that northern Myanmar was a mecca for young people, a paradise for dream chasers. So she quit her job and went to northern Myanmar without hesitation. Before she left, she promised me that she would take me with her when she made a fortune. But then I never heard from her again, as if she had disappeared from the face of the earth. In the meantime, I had heard about the scams in northern Myanmar, and I had a bad feeling about it, so I called the police. But since Isabella was abroad, and I had no concrete evidence that she had been harmed, the police only promised to call the embassy and ask them to try their best to find her. When I came to my senses, I immediately called Isabella's boyfriend, Alan, told him about it, and asked him to come to my house. The video was only 2.5 minutes long, probably taken by someone in the crowd with a cell phone. The camera was shaking badly, and the person in the video was pointing at Isabella on the ground, teasing her and shouting, "Dirty foreign woman." There were also some flashes of tropical plants in the video. After the dwarf stuffed the worm like Isabella into the jar, the crowd dispersed. The person filming seemed to have been bumped into, and during the shaking of the camera, a pagoda was captured. This pagoda caught my attention. I looked it up, and the shape of the pagoda was the famous Shwedagon Pagoda, and Yangon was the former capital of Myanmar and its largest city. Alan sat in front of my computer and watched the video. He didn't speak for a long time. After a while, he suddenly turned to me and told me, his face livid, "I'm going to bring her back." I was stunned for a moment and said, "I've already called the police, and they said they would contact the local police to verify. I can't wait. I have to bring her back." Alan's body trembled with anger. "I can't let her live in this hell. If I don't bring her back, she'll be tortured to death." The image of Isabella, her bloody eye sockets, and her nugget-like figure writhing on the ground appeared in my mind. I knew that if I didn't go, I would be haunted by my conscience for the rest of my life, and would be awakened by nightmares every night. I made up my mind to go to northern Myanmar with Alan and bring Isabella back. Although Yangon is located in the tropics, it is not stuffy, but rather pleasant. When we went, it was October, the most pleasant time of the year. Under the blue sky, flowers were in bloom, the weather was cool, and the breeze was gentle, but Alan and I were both heavy-hearted and had no time for any of this. We just wanted to find Isabella as soon as possible. On the way here, I watched the video over and over again, making sure that the pagoda on it was the Shwedagon Pagoda, the landmark of Yangon. Very obvious, and I was sure I couldn't be wrong. When we arrived at the hotel, to our surprise, we were greeted by a Chinese man who turned out to be my fellow countryman. after a brief chat. I'll call him Lao Zhu for now, because he was a compatriot and a fellow countryman, even though Lao Zhu was very indifferent to us. I still asked him about Isabella, and asked him if he had ever seen the girl in the video. Lao Zhu just glanced at it and looked away. He told us in a cold voice that this was northern Myanmar, where ethnic conflicts were acute, and the situation was very complicated. The anti-government armed forces and the government armed forces were constantly fighting, and there were frequent clashes. And we Chinese were not recognized here. We were caught in the middle, and we were the objects of oppression and bullying. He advised us not to cause any trouble. Alan got excited and argued with Gao Zhu, asking him if he was Chinese. Unexpectedly, Lao Zhu replied directly, and he was a Chinese Burmese, not a Chinese. This left Alan speechless. The next day, Alan and I went to the Chinese embassy in Yangon, showed the staff the video, and explained the situation. The embassy said that they attached great importance to this matter and had received many case files of missing girls like Isabella, not only in China, but also among the Chinese in northern Myanmar. Many people had gone missing. They had joined forces with the Yangcheng police to launch an investigation. I knew it would take some time, but time was what Alan and I lacked most. We were both afraid that Isabella would be tortured to death. When Alan and I returned to the hotel, Lao Zhu was clearly not very welcoming to us. He was probably afraid that we would bring him trouble. Alan and I discussed it, and decided to stake out the Shuidigan pagoda first, preferably until we found the dwarf. This was the dumbest and most feasible way to do it. We thought it would take us a long time and we might not find anything. But to our surprise, the next afternoon we saw the dwarf again, and Isabella, who was already in the jar. I remember Alan and I were on the road discussing whether to change our accommodation, as Lao Zhu had already driven us away several times. Just then, we noticed a crowd gathered at the end of the street, a loudspeaker hanging from a tree, repeating nasty words like foreign woman, pig show, and dirty foreign woman. Alan and I looked at each other and followed the group of children. Soon, we saw a group of people surrounding a dwarf, and in front of the dwarf was a dark altar, about 60 or 70 centimeters high. The onlookers all craned their necks and began to throw money into the bowl. The dwarf man kicked the altar with his foot when he saw that enough money had been thrown in. A woman with disheveled hair and her eyes, ears, nose, and tongue gouged out, slowly poked her head out of the altar. She wriggled her body with difficulty, resting her chin on the altar, trying to get out of the altar. This cruel and funny act made everyone around laugh. The dwarf man kicked the altar over, and the woman fell out of it. She lay on the ground, writhing with difficulty, making a hoarse, babbling sound. Unlike in the video, Isabella in the video still had pain and despair and human emotions, but now she was numb, even flattering, breathing on the ground, trying her best to show off her deformed body. We didn't know what she had been through. Isabella. I tentatively called out to her, and almost instantly, the woman who was still writhing on the ground had tears welling up in her empty sockets. She recognized my voice. She still remembered my voice. She opened her mouth wide, crying and trying to say something, but her tongue had been cut off, and she could only make a hoarse whimper. Her once beautiful features had been gouged out. Her body was covered in wounds, and even several lacerations had not healed. I couldn't imagine what she'd been through, and I didn't dare to think about it. Isabella, the beautiful and lovely girl, The youthful girl whose flower of life had just bloomed, who could have done such a thing to her? Were they devils? Tears streamed down my face uncontrollably. I took off my clothes and wrapped them around her, allowing her a shred of dignity. The dwarf looked at me suspiciously, then jabbered something in a vicious tone and yelled at me. Alan's eyes were red with anger. He almost flew at the dwarf and pinned him to the ground. I even heard the sound of the dwarf's spine snapping. The people around us tried to break up the fight, but the next moment, Alan had picked up a stone from the side of the road and smashed it hard against the dwarf's head. Once, twice, 3 times. The people around were so scared that they ran away. I saw that the dwarf was no longer making a sound, so I ran up and grabbed Alan, making him drop the stone in his hand. I shouted his name and told him to run. Only then did Alan react. He picked up Isabella and ran towards the hotel. We were panting back to the hotel when we bumped into Lozu. Lochu saw our panic and fear and looked at Isabella, who looked like a human pig. He immediately understood everything. Fortunately, his conscience was still intact. He closed the door behind us and told us to hide in our room. Sitting on the bed, I didn't blame Alan. If it were me, if I have his strength, I would have killed the dwarf too. I even thought the dwarf died too easily. Alan asked me what to do. I said that there must be people looking for us outside now, and when the heat died down, we would go to the embassy. They would not ignore us. We would go home first. When Isabella heard the word home, she suddenly struggled, her tears and snot mixed together, her mouth whimpering her emotions, becoming agitated. Alan wanted to hug Isabella, but he didn't know where to hold her. He just shed tears. He was more pained than anyone else by what had happened to Isabella. Looking at Isabella, who had become a human pig, like an agua only to rye, I couldn't help but think of the cruelty and evil of human nature. Such a young girl with bright eyes and teeth, a little girl whose flower of life had just bloomed. Who in the world could have done such a thing? Were they demons? I tried to get something out of Isabella, but she was speechless and unable to write. Even if I let her hold a pen in her mouth, she couldn't write a few words, and I couldn't bear to ask her. It was just getting dark outside when we heard footsteps. Isabella became agitated again at the sound of footsteps shrinking back. Knock, knock, knock. There was a knock on the door. Who is it? Alan walked to the door. Pingja, Pingha. A mist of blood flew up, and I saw Alan slowly fall to his knees, blood gushing from his head. Besides Liu Zhu, there were several other men at the door, all of them with tattoos, the older ones in their 30s, the younger ones barely adults, but all of them with an air of viciousness. One of them had an axe in his hand and swung it at Alan on the ground, until Alan could no longer move. Only his fingers were still trembling slightly. Before I could scream, the first man spat on the ground, walked in, grabbed me by the hair, and dragged me out. I struggled desperately, kicking and beating the floor, trying to make a noise. Bang! The man stopped, grabbed my head, and slammed it against the wall. I blacked out. Bang! Another blow and almost passed out. Before I was dragged away, I saw the cold, disgusted look in Naozu's eyes. I don't know how long it took. I felt myself being dragged into a car, and then there was a long, bumpy ride. I had a splitting headache, and by the time I regained consciousness, it was pitch black. My mouth was taped shut, and my hands and feet were tied together. I was sure I was in a car, and I didn't know where I was being taken. After a long time, the car finally stopped. I was dragged out of the car, and when I tried to resist, I was beaten even more viciously. It was only when I was about to be beaten to death that someone came over, kicked the man who was beating me, and scolded him for a long time. The gist of it was that I was a money-making tool, their source of arms and food, a very precious pig that could be exploited. At first, I didn't understand this sentence, but later I understood, because in my semi-conscious state, I was thrown into a cellar. The cellar was not very large. There was an iron door next to it, which was locked. I didn't know where it led. Beside me were 20 or so jars, all of which I had seen before, about 60 or 70 centimeters high. Isabella had been stuffed into one of these jars after her hands and feet were chopped off. Up close, these jars were more like pots, many of them stained with blood. For some reason, I felt a chill down my spine when I saw these pots. As I struggled to untee the ropes on my hands and feet, I accidentally bumped into one of the pots. The sound was particularly harsh. In the cellar, what was even more horrifying was that there was a rustling sound from inside the pot I had touched. At the same time, the more than 20 black pots also shook, and from the top of the pots, one by one, the heads of women emerged. They had all been mutilated, their noses, ears, and tongues cut off, their eyes gouged out, turned into human pigs. They numbly poked their heads out, turned their heads towards me, and their empty eye sockets made me feel the most cruel and vicious evil in the world. This was the greatest evil of human nature. I huddled in the corner. The more than 20 girls were all pale, their bodies covered in wounds, and all of them were Chinese. I didn't ask them what had happened, because even if they heard me, they wouldn't be able to answer. Like Isabella, their tongues had been cut off. Isabella, right, where was she? I didn't see Isabella among the more than 20 girls. Just as I was terrified, the iron door next to the cellar opened, and a small old woman walked in, carrying a bucket in her hand, which contained some sticky, unknown substance. She just glanced at me and then went about her business. She fed the girls one by one, using a large spoon like stuffing ducks, to pour the contents of the bucket into their mouths. The food smelled of gut, water from a floor. After the girls had finished eating, they climbed back into their jars. The old woman came up to me, scooped up the slop from the bucket with a spoon, and held it to my mouth. Whether I ate it or not, she just stuffed it into my mouth. The slop entered my stomach and I immediately vomited from disgust. The old woman glanced at me, picked up the bucket, and walked out. After she left, several men came in and began to knock on the jars in the cellar, one by one. When the girls poked their heads out, they counted them and carried the jars out. I heard them saying something about foreign women and begging performances. I could vaguely guess that these girls, like Isabella, were going to be taken out to beg. I remembered that Isabella had been in the same situation around the Shwedagon pagoda, naked and undignified in the street, and anyone could insult her as long as they threw money to the dwarf. There was a clay pot in which the woman did not poke her head out. The man looked very ugly and knocked on the pot again and again, but there was still no movement. He kicked the pot over, turned it upside down, and out of the pot rolled a woman whose hands and feet had been chopped off. She had died from the torture, her wounds festering and rotting. The man just cursed, then spat at the body, and continued to carry the pots. When all the pots were gone, he walked up to me, grabbed me by the hair, and told me to go with him. A huge unease welled up inside me, and I began to struggle. He looked down at me, his eyes full of fierceness, and squeezed my neck. Just as I was about to suffocate, I passed out again. When I woke up, I found myself in an abandoned factory. Under the dim light, more than a dozen girls were locked in iron cages, and I was one of them. Outside the cage, 4 or 5 men with guns on their backs paced back and forth. Anyone who spoke or made a sound would be brutally beaten with the butt of a gun until they passed out. Before long, a man stood in front of me, opened the cage, grabbed my arm, and dragged me out. I had been beaten several times, and I hadn't had a drop of water to drink, so I was too weak to resist. I could only let the man drag me to another man. The man was shirtless, with several knife scars on his body, hideous and frightening. He grabbed my hair and forced me to look up, then asked the man next to him, "Where's the man who was with her?" "He killed Anai, and I killed him," the man next to him replied. The scarred man nodded and looked at me, troublesome foreign pig. With that, he waved his hand impatiently and said to his men, "These pigs have been making less and less money lately." The general said that if this continues, he will let them be donors. The word donor made my heart tremble. What was a donor? Those who had their kidneys removed and the organs trafficked were called donors. Then, what about this woman? Asked the man next to him. The scarred man looked at me. "Send her to a Thai. Ruin her face so that she won't be recognized like that pig named Isabella and cause us trouble." The man looked regretful, but he didn't dare to disobey the scarred man. My hands and feet were tied, and my mouth was taped with black tape. Although I tried to struggle, I was carried away like a pig to be slaughtered. As I was being carried to the factory gate, I saw a car parked outside, and more than a dozen women were being herded out of the car. Their faces were ashen, their hands and feet were chained, and as soon as they got out of the car, a group of men rushed at them, shouting, tearing their clothes off, the women's screams mingling with the men's laughter. I was thrown into a thatched hut. The man went in, said a few words to the person inside, and left in a hurry. The thatched hut was covered in bloodstains, and the smell of blood and iodine filled the air. Before long, 2 more girls were locked up with me, their hands and feet in heavy shackles, their skin pale. They must have been locked up for a while. They were pathetically thin, huddled in the corner, their eyes devoid of light. There was a movement in the hut, and a small, thin man with a mask and rubber gloves came out. His eyes were small, narrow, and sinister. He came over and ripped the tape off my mouth. What a waste to ruin such a face. With that, he was about to take me away. But just then, one of the 2 girls suddenly screamed and struggled like crazy. Because of the heavy shackles, her hands and feet were rubbed, bloody. The thin man looked disgusted, threw me aside, gave the girl an injection of anesthetic, and dragged her into the house. I had escaped, and I struggled to sit up. The other girl huddled in the corner, trembling all over, sobbing. I slowly moved to her side and asked her if she had ever seen a girl named Isabella. She looked up at me, her eyes dim, and said no. I asked her again what her name was and how she got here. She cried and said that her name was Sophia and that she had come to Myanmar as a tourist. Later, she was separated from her group by a group of people. She was looking for her tour group on the street when a group of people suddenly rushed out. They called her a mistress, a prostitute, and then they started beating her. People here hated mistresses the most, and she was in a foreign land, and no one cared about her. She was beaten unconscious and dragged into a car. When she woke up again, she was locked in a cage. She told me that there was only one boss here, the one with the scar. They all called him Boss Barton. The girl who had just been taken away by the doctor, like man, was named Rachel. Rachel owed money from a loan shark. She heard from an intermediary online that she could make a lot of money in northern Myanmar, so she smuggled herself over. There were 7 or 8 other girls with her. When they first arrived in northern Myanmar, the intermediary arranged for them to stay in a hotel in Yangon. But to their surprise, that night, a lot of people broke into their room, beat them up, and then stuffed them into a car and brought them here. I asked her what the name of the hotel owner was. She said Rachel said the intermediary called him Mao Zhu. Zhu. My heart sank so loud. Zhu had been one of them all along. Alan and I had randomly chosen a hotel in Yangon, but the hotel owner turned out to be in cahoots with these people. This sent a chill down my spine. Was this a coincidence? How many hotels in northern Myanmar were in cahoots with the people who hurt Isabella? If that was the case, how many people went missing every year? And how many of those missing were like Isabella? That would be an astronomical figure. Shut up. The sinister man with narrow eyes came out, and unlike before, he was now covered in blood. Even his face was splattered with bloodstains. I had heard Boss Barton mention that the man in front of me was called a Thai. A Thai walked up to me with a gloomy face, bent down, and stared at Sophia with vicious eyes. You talk too much? With that, he grabbed Sophia by the throat and pulled out a scalpel from his pocket. Sophia struggled desperately, kicking her feet, shaking her head, and crying out for him to let her go. I shouted at him to let go, not to do this. But obviously, I overestimated myself because my hands and feet were tied, and the blood had not circulated for a long time. As soon as I stood up, I felt my legs go numb, and I fell to the ground with a thud, hitting my head hard on the floor, cutting my forehead, and the previous wound on my head bleeding again. Ty remained indifferent. He used a scalpel to pry open her mouth and cut out her tongue. My vision was red, and I roared, using all the vicious language I could think of to curse him to death. But he just gave me a cold look after throwing away the scalpel and gave me an anesthetic injection. When I woke up, I was lying in a makeshift operating room surrounded by gray-white cloth strips draped over bamboo poles, separating the beds. The overhead light was so white, it almost blinded me. I tried to move, but to my horror, I couldn't feel my limbs. Just as I thought I had had my hands and feet cut off, I suddenly felt my fingers move. I looked down and finally saw my hands and feet. It was because the anesthetic hadn't worn off yet that I couldn't feel them. I thought I had been out for a long time, but it hadn't actually been that long because the wound on my forehead was still throbbing and bleeding. After a while, I regained some feeling and strength in my body, and I could barely sit up in bed, but I still couldn't walk. I didn't dare to make a sound. Ty didn't seem to be in the room. It was eerily quiet. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, and the gray-white cloth strips were stained with blood, so much so that they were almost blood-stained. Creak. The sound from the next bed startled me. "Who's there?" I asked tentatively, but there was no response. So I crawled over, stretched out my arm, and pulled back the curtain. I was instantly horrified, a spasm in my stomach, barely able to contain my anger, tears streaming down my face uncontrollably. It was Rachel. Her hands and feet had been cut off. Perhaps it was too painful. She opened her mouth, her throat making a whimpering sound of pain and resentment. Thump, 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 thump. Footsteps sounded outside, and Dottie lifted the curtain and walked in. Seeing, looking at him viciously, he was a little surprised. You're awake so soon. I knew the dosage wasn't enough. There's a shortage of drugs now, and the quality of the drugs is even worse this time. Several girls woke up in the middle of the operation, and some were scared to death on the spot. What a waste. When he said, "What a waste," he wasn't feeling sorry for their lives. He meant that the girls they had worked so hard to trick, kidnap, and capture had died before they could bring in their due reward. So it was a waste. I leaned against the wall, dilly, trying to put on an expression of numbness to lower his guard. T rummaged through the cabinet and pulled out a photo. Do you know this girl? The girl in the photo was young and full of life. The background was the downstairs of a company in China. This photo was taken before she came to Myanmar. My pupils trembled. It's Arabella. Yes, that seems to be the name. I casually tossed the photo aside. Girls like her are very popular here. They all like beautiful girls. The prettier they are, the more money they can get. This was a photo that Isabella had sent to the intermediary before she came to Myanmar. At that time, a cruel hand had already fallen on her head. Where is she? Where did you take her? I asked. IT said playfully, well, if you had woken up earlier, you could have seen her. But now, he pointed out the window. I followed his gaze and looked out the window. In an open space, there was a large logging machine. The edge of the logging machine was covered with minced meat and bone fragments. This woman, Isabella, caused us trouble. Boss Barton doesn't like trouble, so he removed her organs in advance. It's actually a waste. If it were me, I wouldn't have done that. A beautiful woman like her should be able to make more money. With that, he lifted the curtain next to him. Look, that's what you'll look like later. After a few days of recovery, your tongue, nose, and ears will be cut off, and then you'll be put in a jar, taken around for exhibition, and you'll have to learn some performances. Don't be afraid. I've done this kind of surgery many times, and people don't usually die. Boss Barton specifically instructed me to use the best anesthetic on you, to make sure you don't wake up in pain. After he put down the curtain, he turned his back and muttered to himself as he prepared the medicine. I can never get the dosage of the anesthetic right. The drugs aren't uniform either. I'll use whatever I have. It's a good thing you can still get an IWAR. Thanks to you foreign pigs, the people here love to watch your performances. And they've made a lot of money. He talked endlessly, rambling on, sometimes mocking, sometimes regretful, like a madman. Or maybe he was a madman. Are you done? He turned around immediately at the sound of my voice, and I had already picked up a syringe from the table and plunged it hard into his neck, injecting all the anesthetic into his body. His consciousness began to fade, his eyes full of disbelief. He couldn't believe that I had recovered my strength so quickly. He grabbed my arm and slowly fell to the ground. I followed him and collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to find a way to escape so that I could make this public. I got up, supporting myself on the bed, and found a box of glucose lorry bottles under the cabinet. To prevent the girls from dying after having their limbs amputated, T would also give them glucose injections to keep them alive. I drank 2 bottles of glucose in one gulp and carefully made my way to the door, putting my ear to it. There was no one outside. Then I looked out the window. I could see the abandoned factory building not far away. Maybe because they had brought in more than a dozen women, they were short-staffed, so it was empty outside. But there was one more thing I had to do before I escaped. I looked back at our tie on the ground. After experiencing such malice, my heart had also fallen into sin. My mind was filled with images of Isabella, Alan, and the girls who were locked in the jars. Thinking of what they had been through, my heart raced, and I almost gritted my teeth in hatred. I walked up to a teapot, picked up the scalpel from the table, and was about to slit his throat. It would be difficult to find a doctor who could perform amputations here. If I killed him, at least I could make sure that the girls in the factory would be safe for the time being. But when I turned him over, I saw that his pupils were wide open, gray and lifeless. He had died from an overdose of anesthetic. Boss. Barton wants to know how you're doing with that troublesome woman. Suddenly, there was a cacophony of static and voices coming from under Itai's body. I stood up immediately. The call from the other end of the walkie-talkie only lasted less than 10 seconds before it went silent. I looked out the window and saw more than a dozen people running towards us from the factory. I didn't have time to hesitate. I quickly ran to the bed, smashed the window with a chair, and jumped out. Fortunately, it wasn't high, only about 2 stories high. I listened to the approaching footsteps and jumped. It was getting dark and I was running through the fields. Someone jumped out of the window behind me, and in the distance, more people were running towards me. Gunshots rang out behind me. I couldn't stop. I ran desperately through the muddy rice fields, towards the mountains and forests. I had no direction, no destination. I just knew I had to run. My legs were sore and my heart was pounding. The voices behind me were getting closer. Someone was cursing on the bank of the river, and dozens of people were chasing after me. Gunshots rang out in my ears. I climbed over the terraces, and a pool of water about 10 meters deep appeared in front of me. I looked back and saw that they were almost upon me. I could even see their hideous and hateful expressions. I had no choice but to jump into the pool, but as soon as I hit the water, the force of the impact almost knocked me unconscious. The water pressed against my abdomen, and I almost drowned. And what was worse? Splash! 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 The people behind me didn't give up chasing me just because I jumped into the pool. They jumped in after me, pinned me down in the water, and dragged me ashore. Boss Barton stood in front of me, his face contorted with hatred. "Damn foreign woman," he snarled, grabbing me by the hair. "Do you know that I was the only doctor here, the only one willing to stay here and help us? Now that he's dead, there's no one to treat us. Without a doctor, there will be plagues. There will be infectious diseases." I yelled and cursed at him, saying that they were devils and that they deserved to die. The whole family should go to hell. Their bodies should be left to rot in the wilderness. I was trying to provoke him. Even if I died, it would be better than falling into their hands and becoming a humiliated mummy, making machine without dignity. As expected, he twitched his mouth, took the machete from the person next to him and swung it down at me with a cruel look in his eyes. Baya! A gunshot rang out, and the person next to Boss Barton fell to the ground, blood gushing from his chest. Before he could react, there were several more gunshots, followed by the sound of gunfire and explosions everywhere. Flames shot up into the sky. Boss Barton realized what was happening and ran towards the mountains, yelling into his walkie-talkie. I had survived. I huddled against a tree as a group of government soldiers came up from the foot of the mountain. They exchanged fire with Boss Barton's men. Is she Chinese? Someone asked me. I let out a weak moo. There's another Chinese person here. Come quickly, the man shouted to the people behind him. I was carried away in a daze down the mountain. On the way, I kept repeating that there were many other women on the mountain, that they were locked up in an abandoned factory, and that there were women in the jars in the cellar. I had a high fever and nightmares for days after I was hospitalized. I dreamed of the women in the more than 20 jars in the cellar every night. No. I suddenly opened my eyes and realized that I have left that hotel. The embassy official I had met before, I remembered his surname, was Kai, was standing in front of me. You're awake, Klauki said, excitedly. You're finally awake. I lay weakly in bed. Lao told me that the place where I had been held captive was in a remote mountain in southern Shanxi, where the situation was complicated and ethnic conflicts were serious. The place where I had been held was the territory of a general named Songqi. Boss Barton, whose real name was Barton Randolph, was his right-hand man. They had been using intermediaries to lure girls from China to Myanmar for years, and then they would imprison them, amputate their limbs, and use them for begging performances to make money to buy arms, medicine, and food, and to traffic their organs. Recently, the conflict in southern Shan State had intensified, increasing the need for military expenses and medicine. This had led to the disappearance of a large number of Chinese girls, which had aroused the vigilance of the embassy. After putting pressure on Myanmar, they had launched a joint operation and destroyed Barton Randolph's organization in one fell swoop. More than 30 women had been rescued in the operation, but unfortunately the women who had been locked in the jars had been transferred before the operation. The search for them was still ongoing. I asked Lukai how they had found the place. Do you still remember that man named Lao Tzu? He said. Lao Tzu had his conscience gotten the better of him. Lao Kai shook his head. It was Alan, the young man who came with you. He called us and told us that Tsuji was one of them. Alan, he was still alive. I sat up excitedly, ignoring the pain in my body. Where is he? Lao Kai's face darkened. When we received the call, we immediately sent people to the hotel, but he had already run away. Later we searched every house in the city and caught him that night, on a smuggling boat. We got the information about Barton Randolph from him, and later found Alan's body, which Zhu Ji had hidden in the basement of the hotel. Alan was killed by Zhu Ji after he made that call. Upon hearing this, I was stunned in bed, tears soaking sheets. After returning to China, I stayed in touch with Lao Kai. He would sometimes send me photos of the girls who had been rescued. One after another, they found those girls who had been kept in jars in northern Myanmar. Fortunately, they were still alive, but unfortunately, they could only live like that. Isabella. Mauki told me that they didn't find Isabella's body. There was no trace of her dead or alive. No one knew what had ultimately happened to Isabella. Some said that she might have died on the way to Yangon, her body dumped in the jungle and eaten by wild animals. Others said that Isabella had been sold to a more secluded place, where she continued to endure inhuman torture until the end of her life. There was an even more terrifying theory. Isabella was kept by Miaolan because she was beautiful, and Miaolan was a pervert who liked to make living dolls out of beautiful girls. Of course, this was just speculation. I returned home to that familiar yet unfamiliar city. I quit my job, shut myself at home all day long, not wanting to go anywhere and having no interest in working. I didn't dare to watch the news or go online for fear of seeing Isabella's familiar face on my phone. I hated my own powerlessness, my own weakness. If I had been braver, more determined, could I have pulled her back from that hell? In the dead of night, I would always dream of Isabella, dream of her waving to me, asking me to save her. I hugged Isabella's photo and burst into tears. I knew that I would never forgive myself in this life. Isabella, where are you? Are you still alive? If you're still alive, you have to hold on. I will find you. I will bring you home.